Nick, David, Ellen, thank you so much for this afternoon. So before I introduce you, I just thought of saying hello, and this is a bit of a special edition, let's call it, of the coffee break seminar that happen every Friday. And today we've joined with the annual food agenda, which is part of the EAC food. And it's a special program that aims to bring research to the public. So today we thought, given that it's nearly Christmas, we thought of talking about alternative proteins, but in connection with what we're going to plan on the menu for the big day. And I guess the fact that we're talking about alternative proteins is because most of us, or at least the ones who have decided not to eat meat or not to eat very much meat anymore, is because of either health or environmental reasons. But it's interesting that every time, particularly in the past, I said that I was not longer eating meat, the question was always, oh, where do you get your proteins? It was a big concern. And so I thought, actually, it's easier than we think. And we would like to discuss how easy it is to get the protein. Where can we get these proteins if we don't eat meat or animal products? So I'd like to introduce our panel. And we have David, who is who's a research fellow at the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge. We have Ellen, who is a nearly finished PhD student at the Plant Sciences at the Algae Innovation Center. And then we have Nick, who's the co-founder of Homemade Oats. So I'll pass it to David to tell us a bit more about how much protein do we need, how easy is it, and what can we get instead of the meat. David, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm David, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Cambridge, and I've got a particular interest in seafood. So, Christmas dinner 2050. That's quite a long way off, isn't it? True. But as I'm sure you're aware, if you want to have a safe and happy planet for our kids to enjoy, and for us, we need to do quite a lot right now to become more sustainable. We've been told we need to reduce our meat consumption, given the high carbon footprint, water footprint, and feed requirements of these foods. So perhaps that means that roast beef and turkey are not the best options for Christmas in 2050. But we still need protein, yeah? And how much protein do we really need? And if it's not beef and turkey, what are we actually going to eat for Christmas? First, protein. How much do we need? Well, the current international RDA for protein is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And that just helps you maintain nitrogen balance in your body. But this doesn't actually account for increased activity levels in more active people, or in growing children, or in the elderly who might need more protein. So many medical practitioners or sports scientists, for example, Dr. Stu Phillips, who's a professor in kinesiology and a fellow at the American College of Nutrition, recommend more like 1.3 to 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight, anything up to 2 grams per kilo, actually. That's actually quite a lot of protein. If you just had that in chicken and you're a 70 kilogram male or female adult, that'll be about 600 grams of turkey breast a day. That's quite a lot. Of course, you don't only eat chicken or turkey, you eat other foods, and over the course of a day, you can actually accumulate that quite easily. Back to Christmas 2050 then. If we aren't eating 600 grams of turkey breast to get all that protein, what else can we actually eat? Well, bivalve shellfish, things like clams, mussels, or oysters, are one option. Clams and mussels contain more protein per calorie than beef. They're rich in essential omega-3 fatty acids, and they're one of the richest sources of key micronutrients like iron, zinc, selenium, magnesium. And the great news is they're really sustainable. The farms use up no land, no fresh water. They act as carbon sinks, and instead of polluting our ecosystems, they help act as fish nurseries and provide flood protection. And clams and mussels and oysters compare quite favorably to other meat alternatives like insects, having a better nutritional profile and also a lower environmental footprint. So will bivalves be on the table for Christmas in 2050? Well, that really depends on two things. Firstly, can we farm enough of them? And secondly, can we develop tasty and appealing bivalve food products that people will actually eat? We can certainly farm enough. If we farm just 1% of the coastline worldwide that's actually suitable for farming, we could provide about 1 billion people with all their protein. That's a lot. Most of the research I've led is focused around ways of doing this. But what about tasty food products? We can encourage people to eat traditional bivalve dishes like mussels or clams or paella, all with those ingredients included. But that might be a stretch for some people, especially at Christmas. The other option would be to integrate bivalve meat into our familiar food products, a bit like how corn is used to make meat-style fillets and burgers. The technology is getting there, so using bivalves in a kind of turkey-style clam meat, or using mussel capes rather than beef burgers as a kind of post-Christmas meal could be a great option. So that could be Christmas 2050. Of course, we might hope it actually will be a bit earlier than 2050 so we can do more about the planet. And yeah, I think that's it for me. And I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, David. I thought of asking a very quick question before we go on to Ellen. And the question is, why then are they still so expensive? How can we drive the price down? Because funnily enough, I'm organizing a Christmas meal for some friends and I wanted to get oysters as a starter, very celebratory, so very kind of festive, but they're really expensive. It's cheaper to buy a piece of meat, or beef, even if I wouldn't do it. What do you think is the trick here to drive the market?
Just as a point, mussel meat per kilo is the cheapest seafood or fish you can buy in Europe. So it does depend what kind of bivalve you're buying. The other thing is there is a regional issue worldwide. So in China, mussels, clams, and oysters are all very, very cheap. They're the cheapest form of protein that you can buy, aside from soya. And it's really a distribution issue in a different market in Europe, which is driving some of the higher price for oysters. But at the moment, right now, if you're a UK consumer, go for mussels because they are very, very cheap and you can do a lot with them.
Okay, so I'll switch to mussels instead of oysters tomorrow. Excellent.
Exactly.
Ellen, would you like to tell us a little bit about algae and what can be done and what sort of proteins we get from there?
Yes, so I'll just start sharing my screen, as I think this is my nod to the festive angle of this talk with the most festive algal image I could think of. So this is Haematococcus, which accumulates this red pigment astaxanthin when it's a bit stressed out, but it does go with the festive colours quite nicely. So algae are not just green sludge, they're an incredibly diverse group of organisms, and for the purpose of food, we quite often include cyanobacteria, which are a bacteria rather than all the rest of what's shown on this slide here is eukaryotic microalgae, or macroalgae in fact. And there are over 70,000 species of microalgae, but less than 50 are currently used for commercial purposes. And so hopefully in the future, these are the sort of things we can start to explore to incorporate more into our diets. And just to show you in a bit more of a that they're not just green sludge, I've just included some of my favorite images of microalgae. So we've got some diatoms with their silica frustrals, or the bioluminescent dinoflagellates, or sea kelp, which provides amazing habitats for a range of different organisms, and then the coccolithophores at the bottom with the amazing sort of trumpet coccoliths, and then some green algae along the bottom. But so microalgae and even macroalgae are incredibly diverse, and but why would we eat them is the talk, and we heard a lot about protein already. And so if you look at this graph here, we've got chlorella and spirulina are two microalgae, and if you look at the protein content per 100 grams dry matter, they compare really well to other meat products and better than soy and other plant-based products that we'll consume. So about 60% of their dry weight can be protein. And they have a really balanced amino acid profile. So some sources of protein don't have all the amino acids that humans need, but chlorella and spirulina both do. And they're also a really good source of these omega-3 fatty acids that are really important for human diet. So you can see much better than the per 1 gram of protein, the algae are doing really well compared to the other sources of food over here. And they also have high vitamin and mineral content. So our lab is particularly interested in vitamin B12, which is this really complex micrometabolite that we need. And in human diet, the only source of vitamin B12 is actually animal products, which means that vegetarians and vegans are at risk of developing a B12 deficiency, and they're only made by bacteria. B12 is only made by bacteria. And so particularly with a lot of, as we switch to a more vegetarian and vegan diet, this could be a big issue because we don't want to get the B12 deficiency symptoms, which are cognitive impairment and decline. So traditionally, one source of algal food products that we're quite familiar with are seaweed and nori that you can get around sushi, and actually porphyra, which is the red algae that is nori. It has quite a high B12 content compared to, you've got liver here, which is also where B12 was first isolated from. And so humans have known for ages that we can use seaweed as a really nutritious source of food, but microalgae could become a bigger part of this story, with chlorella and spirulina often sold as products that contain high amounts of B12. But our lab is looking at this more closely because spirulina often contains this form of B12 that isn't as bioavailable to humans as cobalamin. So it's really important that there's more education about algae as a food source and what nutrients we can actually derive from different algal products. So this is what our lab is basically focusing on. So I'm just using this as a bit of an advert for our work. But my project is looking at increasing bioavailable B12 in different algal products. And we've got a project going on where we're creating these chlorella bars that have a high B12 content to see if we can improve vitamin B12 deficiency in India. And my project is funded by the European Space Agency, and we're looking at using algae as a source of bioavailable B12 for astronauts on long space missions. That was actually the picture used to advertise my project, which is pretty cool. So we're based at the Algal Innovation Centre, and we're using this space to investigate how we can grow algae at scale. And this will be particularly important because algae are great because they don't compete with agriculture for land or fresh water. We can grow them in brackish or salt water. They have a really fast growth rate, which means that per unit area per time, they could be 20 times more higher growth rate than land plants. So that's really good when we're trying to be sustainable. And yeah, as I've said before, they're a good source of valuable compounds like vitamins and omega-3s. And so this is just some pictures of us working in the AIC, which again does look like green sludge. So I've not done well to change the image of algae from that point of view. But yeah, that's what we're working on. And in terms of algae in our diets right now, these are some companies that are working on that, just that very thing. So there's these egg replacements, because algae is so high in protein. We can use it as the first vegan mayonnaise from microalgae, or Algenuity is a UK-based company that has taken the chlorophyll out of algae to make these different chlorella colours that make the algae taste better and be more easily incorporated into a range of foodstuffs. So we don't need to wait for 2050. These things are available now, and we can start incorporating them more into our diet. I also experiment with this, and so these are some spirulina cookies I've made and my sister enjoying them. And I hope that we can, yeah, I've convinced you that algae will be a bigger part of our diet in the future. So this is our lab, and I'd just like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering any questions later on.
Thank you, Alan. Your sister did look a bit suspicious, though, I have to say.
Yeah, she wasn't thrilled about being involved in that photo.
But a very quick question before we move on to Nick is, do you know, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but do you know if algae needs to be associated with, combined with other nutrients? Because, I mean, say, for example, beans, and Nick will confirm, ideally would need to be combined with other nutrients. Is algae the same? Would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it would be, I mean, we've eaten algae for ages, and so like you saw with the nori, it's incorporated into a meal, but I think in the future it would be more used as like a flour alternative or something to bulk up an already existing product rather than creating our own, like a whole new thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So always sort of make sure that it's combined with other things to really fill up their protein intake. Nick, would you like to set your stall and tell us a bit about the alternative proteins from the pulses point of view, and then we have a good discussion.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this seminar. It's all a really fascinating topic for discussion. So I've got a few slides which I'm afraid aren't very festive at all, but do help to illustrate what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm just going to hopefully share my screen. Yeah, so here we go. So, although it's not a very Christmassy picture, this is a picture of fava beans, which were the first product that we started Hogmedod to try and get back into British kitchens. But to start on a fairly festive note, I think Christmas and our Christmas dinner does provide quite an interesting insight into and a reminder of our historic diet in Britain, and the importance of feasting and what feasting meant. Because historically our diet would have been largely plant-based, and those plants that provided the majority of our nutritional requirements would have been the arable crops that the early Iron Age farmers brought to Britain from the Fertile Crescent. So those crops were particularly cereals like emmer and rye, spelt, barley and wheat, but also pulses. And the pulses would have been beans, and by beans we mean these beans, which often called fava beans, are also known as field beans. They are essentially the same species as a broad bean, but when we talk about fava beans, we mean the fully mature dry beans rather than the immature green ones. And the other pulse that originated in the Fertile Crescent, but was also suitable to grow in Britain, were peas. And today, again, we think of peas generally as being a fresh or more often frozen green vegetable, but historically they would have predominantly been grown to full maturity and then harvested as a dry crop, which meant they could be stored and eaten through the year. But coming back to Christmas, meat and dairy products would have played a much lesser role in our diets, and would really have been luxury foods that were either used in small quantities to add flavour and richness to largely plant-based dishes, or the only time that most people would have eaten them in any volume would have been when feasting. And of course, in the Western Christian tradition, Christmas is our big annual feast. So that's when we would have really gone the whole hog, if you like, and had the big roast, historically probably beef or goose, as the centerpiece of a feast meal. And then more recently, over the last 100 years, we've sort of adopted turkey as our Christmas dish. But going back to those daily requirements of what we were eating to provide our daily protein, of course, pulses like these beans have a higher protein content than the cereals. Cereals tend to be about sort of between 10 and 15% protein, whereas the pulses are more like 25%. So people would have got the majority of their protein requirements from these pulses, and pulses in modern diets still have obviously the potential to provide us with a lot of our protein. And yet what happened historically was that we, as Britain industrialized and grew wealthier and agriculture developed, and also as we developed better methods of storing and preserving food, we were, as a population, we were able to access more meat and dairy and to eat it more regularly and in larger quantities. And of course, if you can feast every day, then why not? And that's what tended to happen. People moved away from the previous staples and instead started to eat a lot more meat and dairy, and they became the main sources of protein in our diet, to the extent that the only people who had to keep eating the beans, and this picture now shows the beans growing in the field, the only people who had to keep eating them were those who were too poor to really eat a lot of meat and dairy. And so the beans and also dried peas became stigmatized as the food of the poor. Consequently, nobody wanted to be seen eating them, and they just completely fell out of fashion and fell out of our daily diets, to the extent that they were largely forgotten as a foodstuff, except for sort of odd remnants like the mushy peas we still eat with fish and chips, or peas pudding, which is still eaten by a few people, although very much a very particular taste. And then later on, we adopted more exotic pulses into our diet. Baked beans we don't think of as particularly exotic, but all the beans that go into baked beans are imported. They're all grown largely in North America, in the United States or in Canada. We even import some of the navy beans that go into baked beans from Ethiopia, believe it or not. So these are essentially exotic beans that we've adopted into our diet, having turned our back on and forgotten our traditional British grown beans, the fava bean and the dried peas. And of course, we've also adopted pulses and pulse dishes from around the world. Dal from the Indian subcontinent, made with all sorts of wonderful pulses, lentils and urid beans and so on. And also hummus and falafels, often made with, mostly made with chickpeas from the Middle East. So when we started Hodmedod, and here this slide just shows just sort of compares well, it shows some of the more exotic beans of the Phaseolus species, or family, which come entirely from the Americas. But when we started Hodmedod, we were primarily interested in these fava beans, because although we'd stopped eating them, farmers had kept growing them because they are a fantastic crop. They're really low input. They don't require irrigation. They require barely any chemical inputs, if any at all. They don't require fertilizer because, like all leguminous plants, they fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and so provide their own fertility. Not only that, they leave a fertility legacy for the crop that follows. If in a rotation you follow fava beans with wheat, the wheat will benefit from the fertility that the beans have added to the soil. And although we'd stopped eating them ourselves in Britain, and they still provided a very nutritious feed for livestock, the livestock that they're now eating more of. And so farmers grew them mainly for feed, and then later an export market developed to parts of the world where these beans were still appreciated and eaten on a daily basis, particularly Egypt, where they are essentially the national food and the main ingredient of ful madam. It's the national dish of Egypt, which is eaten on virtually a daily basis as a very sustaining sort of spicy bean stew, often eaten for breakfast, and really sort of sets you up for the day with your nutritional requirements. So we thought when we founded Hodmedod, maybe it's time that we in Britain get over this stigma against the beans that grow so well in our country and have so much to offer in terms of sustainable production, but also a very healthy and nutritious foods, as well as being incredibly delicious and versatile. So 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, we launched Hodmedod with the aim of getting these British grown beans back into British kitchens. And these were our first two products, whole beans on the right, which you can use for bean stews like the Egyptian ful madamas, and then the split beans, which are the bean with the skin taken off, so it naturally splits into the two halves of the seed. And the split beans are fantastic for making a dal, or you can grind them up and make falafels, or use them to make an alternative to hummus instead of chickpeas. So we set out to bring these beans and then other pulses, and this shows the typical range of pulses that were already being grown on British farms. So as well as the beans, you've got different varieties of pea, and both the split and the whole beans and split and whole peas. These were already being grown in Britain, but really very little appreciated, very little eaten. often grown predominantly for export, like the beans. The dark brown peas in this bottom left-hand corner are a fantastic, delicious pea called the Carlin pea, which is really chestnutty and really can be used wherever you might use chickpeas. Has a similar sort of firm texture and chestnutty flavour, but predominantly grown in Britain, either to feed to pigeons love them, or to export to Japan, where they are really appreciated and eaten often in sweet dishes, I understand. So we wanted to get these back into British kitchens and back into our diets. We also realised that there were lots of things you could do with these pulses. So the fava beans and the peas you can mill to make a flour, which you can use in all sorts of different ways. Inspired by Spanish habas fritas, we also started roasting the beans to produce a ready-to-eat roasted fava bean snack. And this, which we call our lumpy liquor, is actually a fermented fava bean. So this is just fava beans that have been steam cooked and then had a culture of 3 different microorganisms, fungi and bacteria added, and then fermented in a similar way to a miso. And it produces just a really deep, rich flavoured, lovely fermented sauce that you can use to add oodles of flavour to almost any dish. And in doing all of this, we aim to work with farmers who are working in the most sustainable and regenerative way possible. So farmers like Mark Lee here, who grows organic peas. There he is in a field of Carlin peas. Wakeland's agroforestry, which pioneered agroforestry in the UK, growing crops in alleys between rows of trees. And this then shows another farm in Essex where they're actually looking at, because we then realised there were other crops that could be grown and added to arable rotations, like quinoa, which you see here growing in Essex. So I'm aware I'm using up my time, so I'm going to speed through, but there are also really interesting cereal crops that can diversify the crop rotation beyond just the normal wheat and barley that often go into food processing and end up losing all of their interest and a lot of their nutrition and most of their flavour. This is an oilseed called camelina, which produces a fantastic and very nutritious oil, really good source of omega-3 and omega-6 oils. Chia is another crop originating in South America, but we've found out that it can be grown in Britain. And then looking at other pulses, lentils and chickpeas, which have their origins in the Fertile Crescent with the beans and peas, but weren't so easy to grow in the UK, but we're now trialling and developing production here. So that picture before was lentils, and this one is chickpeas. In terms of what we can eat and what might be on our menus for Christmas in 2050, but on our menus, every day and sooner, we have a huge selection of recipes for the range of crops and foods that we work with. And you can just see a small selection of them here. So I've just slightly overrun my allotted maximum 10 minutes. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. So just
thank you, Nick. That's great. We have a huge variety. And quick question from Emma: what happens to the outer layer of the split bean?
So that's a very good question. It's essentially a waste product, but like all waste products, there are uses for it, and we've been exploring different uses. So the typical use in most production of split beans is that it just goes either as a component of animal feed, because although it is the skin of the bean, it still has some nutrition. It has more fibre than the bean, but still has some protein and other nutrients in as well. Sometimes it just goes for anaerobic digestion, which is sort of the default use of waste from food production. But we're exploring different things to do with it. One of which is that it looks like it can be quite a good sort of basis or part of a food to grow mealworms on. So potentially contributing to production of other alternative proteins. And it can also be used to put fibre into our diet. So you can grind up the skins to make a high fibre flour. And although we're all obsessed with protein and the protein in our diet, I could go on and on about fibre and how really we should probably be more worried about the amount of fibre in our diet. So that's another potential use for them.
That is true, to have healthy guts. We had a very interesting seminar recently. So very quickly then also then, as you just said, could we then use pulses to feed animals rather than keep using soy?
We can absolutely. And
I can see Catherine's question as well.
Yeah, so British pulses are used to feed livestock. They don't have quite as high a protein content as soya, and they tend to not be as cheap as soya in terms of the cost of the protein, if you like, to do with the scale of production and the massive volume of commodity soya production, and also the way it's effectively subsidized means it really is very hard to compete with. But despite that, fava beans in particular are used as animal feed, and I think there's potential to further develop that as an alternative to imported soya, as well as looking at more domestic production of soya.
It could be an integrated at least, even if it weren't replaced completely right now.
Yeah.
The question that we had actually from our audience in advance, which I thought was quite interesting, and perhaps David can pick this one up, but all of you in a way. How can we make a celebratory meal, especially when we think of Christmas? We think of something quite heavy, fatty, and it's going to put you in that sort of zombie state, you know, and you sit on the sofa effectively. So how can we do that? I mean, of course, we are talking about, you know, the fact that we're talking about alternative proteins to avoid meat in a way doesn't necessarily mean that we have to completely cut the meat out. You know, if there are a lot of statistics, and Emma here can confirm, if we could even just eat meat once a week, we would do a massive benefit to the environment. But let's say that we want to have also a vegetarian or vegan Christmas. What would you answer? What would you say to this, David? Maybe.
Well, I'm not a vegetarian expert. I'm a seafood expert. But I think my answer to that is that if you're having a vegetarian or vegan food, there is certainly the option of adding fat to your meal to make things more substantial. And I think, you know, as we've heard earlier today, there's the option of adding some kind of algal oil or you know, mayonnaise or composite made from algae to add the fat to the meal, to add some of that flavor. You've also got other oils such as olive oil and coconut oil, all of which potentially have sustainability advantages or health advantages over something like conventional rapeseed or vegetable oil. So that's one way of potentially adding some fat into the diet. But linking back to actually a question that someone else just asked, just carefully consider the vegetarian vegan argument again at Christmas too. So one person's actually asked, you know, because the government's just changed actually regulations on mollusks and said that crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks are now added to the animal welfare regulations. And what does that mean for us? And one point I can make is that something like a mollusk, so a clam or a mussel, farming it potentially causes far less animal death and environmental damage than growing soya, wheat or rice or beans in the field. You're not displacing mice, rodents, deer, wild animals from their native habitat and causing habitat loss. Instead, you're creating a new ocean ecosystem and supporting fish nurseries. So I think that's a really important point people need to remember about kind of death in their food chain and where it's coming from. It's not just what you see on the table, it's what's gone behind the whole production line. So that's worth bearing in mind.
Can I chip in on a Please, Nick. Yes, and also to address in a way the question of how to make it, you know, a real celebration meal, because I can see that maybe somebody, especially thinking about Christmas, might think maybe a nut roast is a bit boring, or you know, how can we actually make it interesting?
Yeah, so on that question, I think I just added another word for British grown plant-based fats, and I showed you very quickly a slide of camelina, which is a very oil-rich seed which can be eaten as a seed and has that sort of, because it's high in oil, it has that sort of unctuous, satisfying nature to it, but can also be pressed for oil that we can then use in other dishes and you know, create higher fat dishes that satisfy us in that sort of way that higher fat foods do, but without necessarily using animal fats. And then there's hemp as well, which can produce a really delicious and nutritious oil. But also, just coming back to David's point about what the cost is, if you like, in terms of animal lives of the food that we eat, I think it's also worth really keeping in mind the role of animals in agricultural production generally. So a truly vegan production system is really difficult to achieve, and most of small-scale farming tends to be mixed farming, because animals, as well as providing us with meat and dairy, are also incredibly efficient cyclers of nutrients, and it's really hard to achieve that in farming in the complete absence of animals. So, as well as, of course, arable crops displacing rodents and so on, as David explained, often arable farming does rely on animal inputs as well. And if you're producing crops and you don't get them to the quality that's required for human consumption, then using them as animal feed is always a really good alternative, and another way of using up those waste products. So it is really difficult to separate vegan foods and non-vegan foods once you start looking at the whole sort of production system.
Thank you, Nick. This leads me to ask you a question, which also somebody has asked, in terms of, if we think about the variety of pulses that we have available, the mollusks that we have that we can grow and consume, we don't actually really need to go down the route of artificially manufactured products, which are often a composite of various artificial ingredients. What do you think? I mean, we can just rely on what we have, right?
I'm not sure if that was directed at me, but I would agree with that, absolutely. I mean, why eat a highly processed fake
burger
yes,
exactly,
when you can make a falafel? A falafel is if it's a natural plant-based burger, essentially. It's just, we just don't call it that, and we think of it in a different way. And I mean, I think the danger is that we pursue the benefits of plant-based foods single-mindedly in developing these alternatives at the expense of other aspects of nutrition and the sustainability of production. And I would always advocate that we look to eat a lot more plant-based whole foods, and don't get sort of tempted down the line of ultra-processed plant-based foods, exactly, which have a lot of hidden costs.
For the vegan burger or sausage, which has also a lot of flavoring and salt. But David, you also have contributions. I know that about your fish fingers.
I can jump in here. I mean, firstly, I completely agree. Producing huge quantities of ultra-processed vegan foods or fake artificial meats or anything similar like that is not really what we want to be doing. It's not what we want to change our global population's diet to. I think the other thing we have to remember, though, is that the audience today, the majority of us have a good interest in food, probably. We probably have quite a bit of experience cooking, or at least know a fair bit about our food. We forget that the vast majority of the population don't. They go to Tesco's or Sainsbury's, they buy the majority of their foods in packets, they're in a rush, they're on busy stuff, and it's usually stuff from the freezer aisle or stuff from the confectionery aisle. And that's the market we need to be meeting. And I think that there is a place for a bridging point to get people towards those whole foods, towards that whole seafood, towards those whole kind of pulse-based diets. So that's where kind of replacing those less healthy and less sustainable products in your burgers or in your fish fingers or in your other meals with another product. So for example, a mussel cake or a clamfish finger or a bean burger. If we're careful about the ingredients we include and don't make them too processed, that can be quite a good transition route over. So I still think there is place for that within a market much more dominated by a whole food system.
So then the question is also for Ellen in terms of the sustainability of algae and how, and this is a bit of for everyone who wants to pick it up, how can we also make what's the role of consumers as us here in the audience? But what is also the role of the government? Because there's been obviously subsidies to meat and meat producers, but I don't think there've been many subsidies for pulses. I mean, Nick, maybe you can correct me on this. How can we actually drive a sort of, a more top-down approach and sort of contribute to that?
Just to go with the algae thing for a second, I just they're quite a niche product at the moment, unless we're talking about seaweeds. So microalgae is you know, in a lot of health food shops, but it's also quite poorly regulated, and often you don't actually know what algae it is, and it can be branded as one thing, and so there's not a lot of careful regulation on what people are selling as algae, which is obviously really important for consumer trust in what you're buying, and there's not a lot of knowledge, and so I think there needs to be a lot more open communication about what algae products are and what nutritional, because quite often if you go to a health food shop, they promise all sorts of things in them. Like quite often you see chlorella growth factor as like something great that's in chlorella, but actually what is that, and what does that do for a human nutrition point of view? And so I think this is a big area that needs to be more carefully looked at from a governmental scale, and quite a lot of work done in this area before algae becomes you know, incorporated into our diet in the same way that lentils and things already should be. Yeah.
Can there be bad algae, Ellen? Can there be something that actually, if it's hasn't been properly produced, can be actually you know, bad for health? Well,
algae are really good at collecting heavy metals, and so that can be good if we're trying to use them to recycle wastewater. They're really good at sucking up like copper and things in the environment. But obviously we don't want to be eating that. And so, you know, things that are sold in the UK, in Holland, but I'm sure do go through, you know, checks of how much heavy metals are in there. But it's definitely something that needs to be taken into account before we start hugely scaling up. That sort of thing. But because algae is such a good source of oils, this is another way they could be incorporated into the diet, is a lot of fish farming. They feed the big fish littler fish, and you know, and so algae could be incorporated more into that, or we should just eat the algae directly. But you know, there's lots of ways that algae could be incorporated into the food system to make it a bit more sustainable. But yeah. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, Ellen. I think that's definitely an area that we also need to work on and create more communication with policymakers as well. Nick, what do you think instead of the subsidies to the pulse market and all that area?
Yes, so pulses have suffered from a lack of consistent subsidies. There have been times when there's been sort of subsidy initiatives to encourage production of pulses, and that's had some effect, but it's never been consistent enough to really build up the sort of level of production. I mean, I think generally probably about 5% of arable production in the UK is pulses, and you know that could easily be closer to 25, 30, 35% if it was properly supported. One of the obstacles for farmers is that pulses do have more variable yields than cereal crops. So there's less certainty for farmers because they could be looking at a yield, you know, one year it might be a third of what it is in a really good year, whereas cereals, you know, tends to be sort of plus or minus at most 25% from the average. So there's less certainty for farmers, and more consistent support would help to get around that problem, but also just help to get farmers used to growing pulses and what that takes, and how to balance the good years against the less good years. But I think thinking more globally, subsidies do tend to support more animal-based products. You know, there's a lot of subsidies globally for livestock and dairy production, and that side of farming does often get more attention and support than arable farming in general, and pulse production in particular.
Yes, no, exactly. But also, do you work, Nick, with chefs? Because there is an interesting question from Deborah, and and we've been talking about this in other seminars and discussions, that how can people increase the amount of pulses in this case if most of the people don't know how to cook them, they don't know what to do with them. You might now have the occasional recipe here and there, they are increasing, but whose responsibility is it? Is it the chefs? Who maybe we should sort of start promoting more recipes using these ingredients? How do you get by this? How can we sort of help people?
Yeah, so I think pulses, as well as the sort of historic stigma that I talked about earlier, there's a more recent sort of feeling about pulses that they're sort of worthy and dusty and a bit hippie-ish, and they've not been a fashionable food, and they haven't been seen as exciting. But I think that has changed, particularly in the last 5 years or so, and suddenly chefs like Algae, for example, are using more pulses in the recipes they share and the dishes they cook. And I think we do need chefs to be really showcasing what you can do with pulses and other plant-based whole foods to raise awareness and interest and excitement. And we need chefs in restaurants to be using them more, which they are. They definitely, in the 10 years since we started Homodog, we've seen a lot more interest from chefs, and we've seen a lot more recipes being published. But it obviously takes time to develop a food culture and change a food culture and develop people's readiness to cook with ingredients that they might not have grown up cooking or be used to cooking. And I think pulses can sometimes be frightening, particularly dry pulses, because people worry about having to soak them and cook them, and the thing from the 70s about kidney beans, if you don't boil them, you've got the toxins that can be dangerous. But it's very simple just to boil a kidney bean for 10 minutes, and most other pulses don't have that problem at all. So there is just a general sort of education and awareness raising that we need to be doing, and chefs can really play a role in spearheading that and showing the sort of exciting range of pulse dishes that we can be eating, and how often they're really easy to cook. And I would say that a great starting place for anyone cooking pulses would be dal, which is sort of the ultimate comfort food. It's incredibly easy to cook, not necessarily using British pulses, but using, say, split red lentils. You can cook a dal really quickly and easily, and you can cook it in large quantities and then freeze it, and you've got your own ready meals then for weeks ahead, if you like. And once you've mastered the basics of cooking a dal, you can then create endless variations, and you've got a whole range of easy to cook, varied and different and delicious and comforting dishes at hand.
So maybe, Nick, you can give us. So Anthony was asking if we can find Homodog's produce in Cambridge, and we can get onto your website and order a huge variety of products, and there are also all the recipes as well, which are great actually. But I wanted to ask a question, and maybe you can decide who would like to answer that question, in terms of the word that we use, alternative protein. Is it a helpful term that we adopt? Does it sort of give almost like a negative connotation? Is from Richard. Essentially it's not a real alternative. I think I understand his point. It's not an alternative because we can get the necessary protein from very normal and non-alternative ways. What do you think, maybe David or Ellen?
I think it's just a name, really. You can say that these are all alternatives to conventional meat or fish, but many of these things, whether it's beans, whether it's mussels, whether it's to some extent algae, are all things like naturally eaten by huge, societies worldwide. So it's really about just shifting people's dietary choices towards other foods that people already eat, rather than sort of creating a new food type as such, or a new alternative food type.
Yeah, thanks. Ellen, do you want to add anything?
No, I agree. I think it's all in the branding, isn't it? We just need to shift the focus.
Yes. Yeah. You're right. I think I am conscious about time that we sort of getting to our end of the 3 o'clock. But I thought of asking all of you, in fact, what would you recommend to make a festive meal with the ingredients that you've been defending and talked about? And sort of maybe give us some, if you can give the audience a quick recipe or something to take away. Nick, do you want to start? I mean, you've given us loads of recipes already.
Yes, so I gave a glimpse of the loads of recipes on our website, and maybe I'll just select one of those, which again, it's a dal, but it's a very luxurious dal, which is dal makhani. And it's a dal that's not just plant-based, because it typically has some sort of cream or yogurt in it, and that gives it, it gives it that extra sort of luxurious unctuousness. It adds fat that we were talking about earlier. It's also a dal that uses more than one pulse, so you're getting a variety. Typically, it's a type of bean, and also black lentils often are the classic things that are used, but you can vary that. And it is eaten as a feast food in the Punjab. And I think if we were looking for a sort of luxurious feast dal, then that would be a great choice, and also allows us to get a little bit of non-plant-based food into our diet, which I'm not a vegan personally, and I don't advocate absolute veganism. I just think we need to be eating a lot more plant-based foods, and as I mentioned earlier, particularly in small-scale sustainable farming, there's a role for some livestock, and so I think that there is definitely a place for small amounts of really well-produced, high-quality meat and dairy in our diets, and dal makhani brings those things together. Yeah,
I think you use the right word, good quality. So reduce the amount, but really go for good quality. David, would you recommend maybe oysters as a starter?
No, because it's expensive, actually. So I'll stick with the Christmas theme though. So I guess quite often as kind of canapes or starters, people might stuff mushrooms with breadcrumbs and garlic at Christmas. And to that breadcrumb and garlic stuffing, try adding some mussels or clams, just the meat, in that stuffing to then put in the mushrooms, and that can make a really good starter. I think going back to what people are already eating at Christmas, if you've made that roast beef for Christmas, or you've made that duck and turkey, there will quite often be a lot of veggies left over. So lots of carrots, parsnips, broccoli, etc. The next day, make a fisherman's stew. So put all those veggies in a pot. Add, some muscle meat from the supermarket, from Sainsbury's or Tesco's, and that can make a great food to sort of see you through till New Year.
Nice sea bubble and squeak, effectively.
Effectively, excellent. Yeah.
Great. Ellen, what should we do with maybe any green pudding with spirulina, or what?
That's what I was gonna say. I guess pepper dulse is in lava bread, so you could use lava bread as a starter with something, I guess. But also, I was gonna say, as a pudding, to make those spirulina cookies, I swapped 20 grams of flour for 20 grams of spirulina powder, and I'm pretty sure you could use that in quite a lot of different baking applications. It does make it a funky green color, but I guess that is sort of festive anyway. So,
yeah, that's true. It's green.
Yeah, and the cookies go down well in the lab, so I don't think they taste pretty good, even though they look very, very green. Goes well with dark chocolate, I found. Spirulina.
Lovely. Or the lava bread with the smoked salmon, maybe. Could be nice. Lovely. Unless there are other questions or any more comments that our panel would like to make before we close, would any of you give any sort of pearls of wisdom before we say goodbye? No? Okay. And I don't see any more questions, so I think we have addressed most. And yeah, so I would like then to conclude. I think we have to show again our slide with our annual food agenda, which has been great to promote. And I hope it's been helpful and come away with inspired in finding out more about pulses and seafood, etc., and algae, of course. And yeah, I wish you all a very good Christmas. So I'm definitely going to have scallops at some point, and a nut roast, Nick. Thank you so much, everyone. And I don't think we have to show any other slides, so that's great. Have a good Christmas.